Let's get more on the Prime Minister's pledge for first home buyers. Saul Eslake is an economist and Vice-Chancellor Fellow at the University of Tasmania. And that's a new title for him, so I just stumbled over that a bit because I hadn't seen that one before. And he joins us now from Hobart. Saul, g'day. Great to have you to chat to once again. So take us through the details of this lifting of the cap and what that will mean.
The scheme under which the government guarantees the deposits of people who can only raise 5% of the purchase price from their own resources, but need typically a deposit of at least 20% in order to qualify for a mortgage. And if they can't raise that, ordinarily they have to pay for mortgage insurance so that a lender will lend to them so they can in turn buy a house. The number of places under that scheme was increased to 50,000 per annum in the recent federal budget. And the most recent announcement by the government is to lift the caps on applicants' eligibility for that scheme based on the price of the house they're seeking to buy. For example, in the case of Sydney, that cap has been lifted, I think, from $800,000 to $900,000, and there are similar increases in the caps applicable to other capital cities and regional areas in recognition of the fact that house prices have risen considerably over the last 2 years in particular.
So to what extent will this help first home buyers get into a home?
Well, it will help some people who are able to arrange their affairs in order to make sure that they qualify for this scheme. They will potentially save on the mortgage lender's insurance that they would otherwise be required to take out in order to qualify for a mortgage. But in the longer run, and from a broader perspective, what schemes like this do is push up the price of housing, essentially by the amount of additional assistance that's offered. We have in Australia now almost 60 years of history that says overwhelmingly convincingly that anything that allows people to pay more for housing than they otherwise would, which is what first homeowner grants, stamp duty concessions, and schemes like this that allow people to borrow more than they would otherwise be able to, schemes that allow people to pay more for housing than they otherwise would, result in more expensive housing rather than in more people owning housing. I don't think it's any coincidence that the home ownership rate has been declining ever since the first census after the first homeowners grant was introduced by the Menzies government in 1964. And even though governments have come up with a bigger range of more expensive schemes that put cash into the hands of would-be home buyers, the house prices have continued to go up at a faster rate than incomes, and home ownership rates have continued to go down, and yet governments continue to do the same thing. I think the reality is that for all the crocodile tears they shed about the difficulties faced by the roughly 100,000 or so people a year who become homeowners for the first time, and those people would like governments to do things that stopped house prices going up as much. The reality that all politicians are aware of is that there's at least 11 million voters who own at least one property. Within that, there are at least 2 million who own two or more. And of course, those voters want governments to keep doing things that push housing prices up or stop them going down. And this is yet another example of that kind of scheme. The other difficulty with this scheme, of course, is that by encouraging people to take out mortgages with equity of their own of only 5%, or in the case of another scheme as little as 2%, they are putting people at greater risk of finding themselves in negative equity should prices go down rather than up. And we know that house prices in Sydney and Melbourne fell in March. And if interest rates go up, as they seem almost certain to do over the second half of this year and probably next year as well, then there's at least some chance that house prices will continue to fall in at least some parts of Australia. And so people who enter these schemes, people who are able, as I say, to arrange their affairs in order to qualify for the limited number of places available, could be putting themselves at some significant financial risk. And of course, we saw in the years leading up to the global financial crisis in the United States just how risky that can ultimately be.
So as far as you're concerned, this is actually counterproductive, and governments are failing to learn from lessons past.
Absolutely. And I mean, this government is no different from any of the other governments we've had over the last 50 years. They simply keep doing the same thing, that is, coming up with schemes that allow people to pay more for housing than they otherwise would, the result of which unambiguously is more expensive housing rather than higher home ownership rates. And as I say, that seems puzzling at first glance, given what politicians say about how they're trying to help people get their first foot on the property ladder. But when you dig into the facts more deeply, it becomes obvious why they keep doing these things, because there are far more votes to be had in schemes that push prices up than there are in schemes that restrain the rate of growth in property prices.
So as far as you're concerned, do you think they should be more honest when they're announcing policies like this?
Well, what I'd prefer is that they didn't announce policies like this, that they didn't pursue measures that serve only to increase the price of property and to reshuffle the queue of would-be first home buyers in favour of those who are able to arrange their affairs in order to qualify for whatever schemes of assistance are available. I would prefer that political parties pursued policies that boosted the supply of housing and stepped back from policies that unnecessarily inflate the demand for housing. But the problem is that policies which put further upward pressure on house prices are extraordinarily popular with a very large proportion of the electorate. And that, I think, is why politicians of both major political persuasions keep doing the same thing, even though it fails to achieve the objectives that they're claiming to support.
Yeah, and so when you look at broader housing policy in Australia and incorporate policies that include prices like negative gearing, what do you make of the government policy in relation to housing over the last couple of decades?
Well, I think government policy, and you say the last couple of decades, so it's important to note this, that we're talking about governments of both political persuasions that have been in office over not just the last 20 years, but the best part of the last 60 years, have consistently pursued policies that have added to upward pressure on prices and have resulted in a decline in the home ownership rate to the point where at the 2016 census, the home ownership rate was the lowest it had been since the census of 1954, though nowhere near as low as it actually was then. But for people under the age of 45, the home ownership rate at the 2016 census was at least as low as it had been in 1954. And I suspect when the results of the 2021 census are released later this year, for some groups in our community, the home ownership rate may well be as low as it was at the census of 1947. And I think that's a stunning indictment of the failure of the housing policies that have been pursued by governments of both political persuasions for almost 6 decades.
And so just briefly and finally, then how do you compare what Labor is putting forward at this election to what the government's putting forward?
Well, I think it's a great pity that Labor walked away from the policies on negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount that they took to the last 2 elections. I'm not a political scientist, but I struggle to believe that those policies were the reasons why the Labor Party lost the last election. They had plenty of other lead in their policy saddlebags that I think can explain that, but they have their own reasons chosen not to pursue those policies, even though it has to be said that the American variant of negative gearing was abolished by the Reagan administration in 1986. The British variant of it was abolished by the Conservative government of David Cameron in 2015. This is not something that is the exclusive prerogative of left of centre parties. Right of centre parties have done this in other countries, and I think it's a pity that neither left nor right of centre parties are willing to do that in Australia. At least the Labor Party is prepared to do a bit more at the margin to boost the supply of social housing through the off-budget Housing Affordability Fund, social housing fund that the Labor Party is committed to. That is at least a measure that will boost supply rather than unnecessarily inflating demand. But I wish the Labor Party would also commit to winding back the schemes that the current government has introduced that really serve only to inflate demand and push up the price of housing to the detriment of would-be first home buyers.
Yeah. So it's always really good getting your analysis, really good getting some independent analysis of what's being put forward there by the parties. Thanks so much for having a chat to us and putting that in a historical perspective too.
Thank you very much for having me, Joe.